Howdy, folks. Welcome to Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb, and I am the redneck, and you bet I've gone green, and I'm trying to convince you to do it too. And as you know, we come onto this platform once a week. We're on YouTube, we're on Rumble. We also record an audio podcast and make that available to you. So I'm going to ask you, however you're watching, if you're watching live, you can participate by dropping a comment and we'll integrate you into the show. But regardless, I'm going to ask you, please like, comment, and share this. I know everybody says that. And the reason everybody says that is because that's the only way to break out of the corporate algorithm to control what is being heard. Because remember, this is non-corporately filtered news, information, and analysis that is designed to not just have a ain't it awful conversation, but to actually win a new world. I always like to remind folks that we follow the no, feel, do model here on Redneck Gone Green. In other words, we ask ourselves, what do we want y'all to know about? And that we want you to know that we are past too many tipping points, that continuing to just tweak things at the margin is not going to get her done, and that we've got to make transformational change. That means we want you to feel both a sense of urgency, but also a sense of genuine hope that there is, in fact, something that can be done. Because what we want you to do is to participate in this conversation and be inspired to do the things that we're talking about on the show. Because every week, it is our task and challenge to bring you examples concretely of people doing the work where they live, work, play, and pray, to not just complain about things, and not, although there's plenty of things to complain about, and not just to vision a new world, although visioning that new world is possible. But we're also talking to people who are doing it on the ground, actually making that change happen. And this week, our guest is a perfect example of that. Emily Kawano is the founder and co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network and co-director of the Wellspring Cooperative Corporation, which is seeking to create a new community-based job creation program in her community in Springfield, Massachusetts. Wellspring's goal is to use what they call anchor institutions to purchase and create a network of worker-owned businesses located in the inner city that will provide both job training and entry-level jobs to both unemployed and underemployed people, specifically through worker-owned cooperatives. Emily is an economist by training and has served in academia. In fact, she served as the director of the Center for Popular Economics from 2004 to 2013. Before that, she actually taught economics at Smith College. She's worked as the National Economic Justice Representative for the American Friends Service Committee. You may be more familiar with it as the Quakers. And in Northern Ireland, she founded a popular economics program with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. So Emily's got a very impressive resume and is a personal friend. Emily Kawano, welcome to Redneck Gone Green. So I don't know what just happened, Emily, but I actually did not hear you. So let's try that again.
Because I was muted. Sorry about that.
That is the proverbial refrain of COVID, isn't it? You're muted. So Emily, let's start again. Welcome to Redneck Gone Green.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
All right. So listen, Emily, I kind of like you heard that introduction. I set a high bar for you, lady. So what I want you to do, though, is to start big picture, because the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network is where I remember meeting you at the U.S. Social Forum back in, 2007 in Atlanta, Georgia, right? And I remember you and your colleagues, Julie Matai and a host of others, had an entire series of events that y'all did around cooperative economics or solidarity economics. So before we get to Wellspring, I want you to share with Redneck Gone Green viewers and listeners, what the heck is the Solidarity Economy Network and where did it come from?
Right. Okay, so yeah, Solidarity Economy Network emerged out of that U.S. Social Forum, indeed, in Atlanta in 2007. I was at the Center for Popular Economics at the time. I was the director there, and we helped to organize a whole track of workshops on solidarity economy. I'll say what that is in a second. Um, and we also held a couple of meetings in addition to those workshops. And out of those meetings emerged or was launched the US Solidarity Economy Network. At the time in 2007, I would say that the term and the framework of the solidarity economy was pretty much completely unknown. And so I'm really happy to say that now, 15 years later or so, it's a term that's very widely known in progressive, sort of on the left, social movements and organizations.
You know,
So, yeah,
that was certainly true for me, Emily, because I remember back in 2007, I had not heard that term specifically. I'm gonna be honest with you, and uh, folks, I have to admit, so I'm the co-coordinator of currently of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network with Emily Kawano. And Emily, back in 2007, I remember thinking, listen, I'm glad that that's all well and good, and I'm glad that there are people trying to do co-ops, but I'm a serious revolutionary. I'm trying to restructure all of society. And the reality is, I over the last 15 years, I have not only been won over, I've actually I'm all the way in. And the reason I'm all the way in is because it's not just tweaking capitalism, is it?
right. Solidarity economy is really clear about where we stand on that spectrum. Do you believe that capitalism can be reformed to be a more just and sustainable and democratic and cooperative world, or do you believe that we have to move beyond capitalism? So solidarity economy is very, very clear that we have to move beyond. There are too many things sort of intrinsic to capitalism. We're not going to get there where we want to get to through reforming capitalism. So, yeah, that's something that um, we're very clear about. And there are a lot of different strands of trying to make the world a better place, and a lot of them fudge on that issue, right? Let's just do good things and support good works, but without that clarity about where you're trying to go in the long term, it's pretty likely you'll end up reforming capitalism and sometimes even strengthening capitalism by reforming it and making it a little maybe kinder, a little more gentle, but it'll actually reinforce capitalism, and we don't believe that ultimately that's the way to go.
And I'm going to use this opportunity then to say, all right, so tell us, what are the core principles of the solidarity economy framework?
Right. So solidarity economy is absolutely grounded in values, and those values will look slightly different in different places, different countries, different regions. The US Solidarity Economy Network uses five. So solidarity, cooperation, mutualism, all that kind of stuff. So that's one. Participatory democracy. So certainly beyond the voting booth, right? Democracy in communities, democracy in the workplace, democracy, right? So that really bringing it into all aspects of our lives. Sustainability, pretty self-explanatory these days. Equity, we talk about equity in all dimensions, so race, class, gender, ableism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the last one is pluralism, which is very important. It means that this is not a one size fits all model. We don't have a blueprint. We don't claim to have the right answer. There are many different approaches that fit under this big tent. And we have to be humble. And instead of throwing stones at fellow travelers and saying, "No, you're wrong. My way is right," right? We should be respectful, see what works, hear each other out, engage in good debate, good principled, constructive debate, and build our path through these explorations.
So, Emily, I'm going to back up and really go deep on this pluralism piece because for me, this is one of the things that is both most inspiring and can sometimes be the most challenging, right? Because the solidarity economy principles are, as you say, very clear. There's a framework, and solidarity economy as a framework is explicitly post capitalist. But the framework itself says pluralism,
Hmm.
try other things,
Hmm.
be willing to be open. And that includes reforming, right? So one of the
Yeah.
things that I think has been incredibly inspiring to me, and I'll admit sometimes challenging, is to hold the space to say, looky here, solidarity economy is post-capitalist, but you can do things within the capitalist framework that still are solidarity economy practices, and we're going to applaud and lift that up. And I feel like that tension, a creative tension, can really be a spot of some real juiciness.
Yeah. People are in different places about this. Some people will try to will really try to draw a hard line. Me personally, the way I look at it is a reform is post-capitalist if if that's where you're headed. So I often use the example of the fight for 15, which, if you're on the left, you can't argue with that. Of course, you're going to support raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Um, if that's where you end, right? If that's your end goal, just the fight for 15, get that $15 an hour wage. I would say that's reformist, right? It's still completely within a capitalist context. You're making things a little bit better, but capitalism is very malleable and can absorb that and move on. Um, if your goal is to fight for better working conditions, but your long term goal is to transform the system, then you'll use that fight for 15 to build towards real transformation. So I think most things, most reforms can be transformative or non-reformist reforms if you have that long-term vision and you know that you're moving beyond capitalism. If that's always the context within which you're working, then I consider it a transformative reform.
And Emily, that reminds me that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, credited with the New Deal that had some fantastic reforms. I mean, I'm looking forward to get some of that good socialized medicine when I turn 65. I mean, I've
Yeah.
been paying into Social Security. I mean, we can go down the list of those, really quality reforms that made people's lives better. And I remember my mama and papa talking very specifically about how that made their lives better. My papa actually went to work during the WPA, right?
Uh-huh.
But FDR actually said, I saved capitalism.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. He said, I don't know why all the industrialists and business leaders are so angry with me. I saved capitalism. And I would argue he did.
Yeah.
Like,
Absolutely.
and so I think that this is
Great
the
example.
right. And so, Emily, like, I kind of we've had lots of guests that have done a great job of critiquing the current capitalist system, and then offering visions for like a new world. I set you up though with Wellspring as an example of somebody who is putting these principles and values into practice, right? So now that we've talked about the solidarity economy framework. We've talked about especially the pluralism piece and what that means to us and why it's so important. I'm going to challenge you to give us an example there in Weston, Massachusetts, about what it looks like to apply these principles and values.
Yeah. So I went from being the executive director of the Center for Popular Economics. So we're a collective of progressive economists, progressive to radical economists, that are all about helping people better understand how the economy works or doesn't work. And I think we had always done a bang up job critiquing capitalism, and we did a less good job um, helping people imagine and engage with what is the alternative until we really turned to a solidarity economy framework. That was really helpful for us. And we went from embracing that as part of our bag of teaching tools and frameworks to thinking about getting our hands dirty, getting involved locally in economic development work. And so we were thinking about applied research to support solidarity economy initiatives, and as well as actually developing solidarity economy initiatives. And so we started. At the time, I met my co-director, Fred Rose, and we started shopping around this idea about building on an anchor institution model, which is at the time was being pioneered by evergreen cooperatives in Cleveland. So building these relationships with anchor institutions to develop cooperative businesses that could meet the needs of the anchor institutions. So maybe the anchor institutions then had some bragging rights about buying local and supporting local job creation and wealth building. So we started shopping around that idea, and that part started to take off. So there were a number of years where um, I was working at CPE, but some of my time was spent building up Wellspring. Eventually, the Center for Popular Economics decided to stick with the popular economics education and not do the research and not do the economic development. And in 2013, I switched over to work full time at Wellspring. An example of where the vision was important. So I was absolutely bringing a solidarity economy framework with me, um, but that's not where we built our collaboration, right? I did not start talking about solidarity economy for quite a long time. It was years before I started even talking about that, because the people that we were working with, anchor institutions, the hospitals, the colleges, and then other folks in Springfield, Massachusetts. I wouldn't say most of them were particularly radical, right? So we started with talking about cooperative businesses and being owned by workers, and democracy, and it that was appealing to people. We talked about wealth creation, so that if the co-op thrives, workers get to engage in profit sharing and build up some wealth. That was appealing, right? Like we got zero pushback on that.
And in
But at
fact,
the same time, there were people in the initial circle that were saying things like, this is great, like leveraging anchor institution purchasing. But look, there's this small business and that small business, and why don't we support them, right? So they were about local small businesses. And we really had to push back and hold the line on no, we're committed to cooperatives. And we didn't necessarily say cooperatives are not a capitalist enterprise, right? We didn't necessarily go into that, but we had to hold our ground. I really believe that. We could easily have lost that thread. We could easily have been about just any small business, whether it's a cooperative and democratically owned and managed, or just any old local small business, and get that anchor institution support. That we could have easily fallen into that, because there was a lot of pushback in the early days about that. So it's just an example where that long-term vision of knowing where you're going is really important.
It really is. And again, that's that creative tension around being genuinely pluralistic, but having a core set of principles to make sure that you don't lose that. I want to circle back about a couple of things. One, I want you to explain a little more about the anchor institution strategy and what that means. So, if folks are not familiar already with the Evergreen Cooperative in Cleveland, just like imagine somebody doesn't know what anchor institutions mean. Walk us through that again, please.
Right. So an anchor institution is usually a large institution, often eds and meds, so educational institutions and healthcare systems, hospitals that are anchored in place. Gen Like we only work with, in terms of our anchor institutions, we work with nonprofits. Um, so they're anchored in place, right? Those colleges, those universities, those hospitals, they're not going anywhere. They're not picking up stakes and moving to some place with lower wages, right? They're anchored in place. But they're also anchors of the local economy. So, oh, like between UMass and like the major healthcare system, Bay State. I mean, those are two of the largest employers in Western Mass. So that's what it means to work with these anchor institutions, and it's a long process of building that relationship. We spent a good 2 years just building those relationships and also doing the research, like what do they purchase, where we might be able to form a co-op around, and also what do they purchase where they're purchasing from far away, so that maybe we could build a local supplier.
Folks, you're listening and or watching Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb. I am the Redneck, and I've gone green, and I'm trying to convince you to do it too. And by the way, that does mean Green Party, but it also means deep ecology. It means rethinking how we live, work, play, and pray together in community. It means, I don't make any bones about it. I'm trying to red the greens, and I'm trying to green the reds, right? I'm trying to actually normalize the idea that we can meet all of our needs to not just survive, but to thrive, live rich and meaningful lives without exploiting anyone, without allowing anybody to exploit us. And get this, it could literally be done in a truly ecologically sustainable way, in genuine balance with Mother Earth. And here's the kick, y'all. That's not a new way of doing things. That's the ancient way of doing things. This is how human beings have lived on planet Earth for about 97,000 of the 100,000 years that we've been on this planet as Homo sapiens, more or less. I would argue that this solidarity economy way of doing things, of like actually doing commerce and creating things for use value for us to use and doing it together collectively, that's our birthright. That's how we're supposed to live. That's actually how our DNA, and in fact, ethnobiologists and paleo, like everybody will that's looked at it, has basically said if humans had not been cooperators, we would have basically perished as a species. Literally, cooperation has been what it took for us to go. We're speaking with Emily Kawano. She is the co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network and the co-director of the Wellspring Cooperative Corporation. Emily, I want to circle or dig deep onto one thing. You mentioned that there were a lot of folk who got really excited about, okay, let's do this, but hey, look at all these small businesses. Let's support local small businesses. And you and others really held the line there. And one of the things that I want to invite you to talk about is what some of the good methodological based science shows about worker owned cooperatives. I remember the first, like, worker owned co-ops like appeal to my principles, but one of the things that I was astounded by was the amount of research that shows worker owned cooperatives last longer by far than traditional businesses. Can you talk about that and why?
Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of the data show that worker cooperatives have better survival rates, right? Survival rates for small businesses is really high. I mean, depending, the estimates vary, but it can be as high as 80% in the first 5 years. And worker co-ops do better than that, like tend to survive longer. They tend to have much less turnover, better promotional opportunities. They tend to be have better benefits.
Better
They tend
wages.
and better wages in in that same sector. Um, they This is an interesting one. They tend to correlate with more civic engagement. I mean, I think because once you get used to having a voice in your workplace, it can spill over into, your life in the community. Um, yeah, in general, like the multiplier effect, how much the dollar circulates locally tends to be higher for co-ops because they will have a focus. They'll do their best to spend locally. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of job satisfaction is consistently higher. So
And
there's a lot of data that show that they do better than traditional capitalist businesses. Um, there's plenty of ways to go wrong. It's still a small business, right? It still has to contend with all the challenges of a small business. But and it there are also challenges that come with collectively managing, which doesn't mean it's necessarily a flat management style, right? There can still be a hierarchy within a co-op, but there is much more voice built into a worker co-op than, in a traditional business where there's no guarantee that workers have any voice, any rights at all.
and that's the thing that I think it's important. Like, look, you talked about the multiplier. Some economists, I think, call it the elasticity of money. How often dollars circulate in a local economy, and it's really interesting to me. I remember. I think I first came across that as an economist. You were probably steeped in it, but I was exposed to it probably about the time I met you through the folks at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance.
Mm.
And I remember diving deep on it, and they actually showed, again, with good methodological research data, that a dollar spent on the same exact good or service, if you spend that dollar, a corporate franchise, a local corporate franchise, it tends to circulate about 2 up to 3 times in the community before that dollar leaves. If you spend that exact same dollar on the exact same good or service in a locally owned business, it tends to circulate about 7 times. So, like before it leaves. And then when the folks at the Democracy at Work Institute did a study on that money. Again, I think of it as
Multiplier.
elasticity, the
Mm.
multiplier. I may be using the word incorrectly. I see. For those of you who are listening, you can't see Emily, the economist. I think I've used the word incorrectly. But I'll just say that the multiplier, the cooperative multiplier, it doubles that. It's literally about 15 times. And I remember asking why. And the answer was because the locally owned independent business just naturally does that, right? But co-ops tend to have frankly, a principled ideological position, seek it out. And so it ends up multiplying even more. And this is the thing that became really fascinating to me. And again, I got won over. Like if you had told me 20 years ago, that I would be like a co-op champion and that I'd spend a lot of time incubating co-ops, I would have literally said, look, co-ops are all well and good, but we can't co-op our way past capitalism any more than we can recycle our way into ecological sustainability. And I'll say, I still believe that, but I'll tell you this, if we create co-ops with the intentionality of supplanting and transitioning out of the capitalist framework, I think we might actually be able to do that. I think that we could literally replace the entire economic system if we actually show, not just tell, but show people this is what it's like to be an empowered worker. This is what it feels like to actually own your own labor, to own your own mind, to be able to participate in these sort of things. So to me, Emily, like this idea of having a core set of principles and values and then applying them in the real world with people who may not share, our collective vision, that's both the sweet spot, but it can also be pretty rocky sometimes.
Yeah, I do want to say I agree with you that we're not going to co-op our way out of capitalism. Um, And I do really, really, really want to emphasize that solidarity economy is not equivalent to co-ops, because that is a misimpression that a lot of people have, that it's just co-ops. It's not. It's a whole universe of things, some of which is market based. It's about producing things for sale, but some of it is asking ourselves, what can we on a local community level produce for ourselves, right? It might be growing our own food. It might be mutual aid. It might be tool shares, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole host of examples of things that align with solid practices. I call them solidarity economy practices that align with the solidarity economy principles. And that is the solidarity economy, right? This whole huge foundation that we have to build on. But right now, all these things, so co-ops and participatory budgeting and public banks and local currencies and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? There's really a lot. Um, they tend to be somewhat either invisible or they're treated like cute little things, like, oh, that's a cute little co-op, because it's seen in isolation from the others. And if solidarity economy is all about creating a framework or maybe a skeleton to start knitting these different practices together so that we can see that there's this huge foundation. There is a foundation of a different kind of economy and world that exists. It just doesn't operate. The dominant system is still capitalism. The dominant logic that we learn is still capitalist.
And
Yeah.
Emily, you wrote a seminal essay that really helped to win me over, and I think a lot of other people. And in that, I remember you described the difference between, and I remember as an undergraduate coming across Homo economicus.
Mm.
I'm going to invite you, see if you remember your own writing, to tell us who and what Homo economicus is, and your reframe of that person.
Yeah. So economists, right? Like economics, which is the study of the economy, economic theory, it's a story, right? It's just one story. There have been other stories. There have been other economic systems. Capitalism is still relatively young, couple hundred years, couple hundred plus years. So pretty young. Anyway, capitalism tells this story, and every story needs a character, and the central character in capitalism is Homo economicus, rational man, and literally man. So the assumption is that we are all rational, calculating, self-interested, and that we're always doing this calculation about what's going to give us the biggest bang for our buck or
And it's always
our
the
effort.
individual, by the way. Let's be
It's
clear about
always,
Homo economicus. It's like
yes,
private
very,
maximization for myself. Like Homo economicus is a really self centered,
yes,
selfish
yes.
SOB.
And yet, the theory is that by everybody behaving like Homo economicus and pursuing their own individual self-interest, we will get the greatest good for everybody, right?
Right. I
That's
mean, I
that's
got to tell you,
capitalism.
in what world have we ever said, like, if we just let everybody be greedy for themselves, that somehow everybody comes out? Like, that's like on its face, that seems crazy, right? But
Well, there's a
in,
whole economic theory about why that is. And there is a certain story there, right? That if you're a bad act, so if you have a business and you're a bad actor, you're acting really in a greedy manner, but you're doing it by cheating people. Eventually some competitor is going to come along and everybody's going to flock to them. So that's the kind of, you can be self-interested, but you will be forced to behave in a somewhat principled way. Otherwise you're going to get wiped out. Now we know that that actually isn't what's happening, and especially once you obtain sort of monopoly power, then you're free to be as abusive as you want, because there's no alternative, right?
So,
And you can prevent those alternatives or those competitors from springing up and giving you any trouble. So anyway, there's lots of problems with Homo economicus, but the assumption is that we are also competitive, right? And in a whole bunch of disciplines, from anthropology to sociology to biology to physics, even, right? There is more and more and more evidence that we are hardwired to cooperate. Yes, I would not ever deny that there is some of Homo economicus in all of us, right? We all have some self interested motivation, but we are also hardwired to cooperate and to engage in also altruistic behavior, right? It's not always even that it's going to come back, right, in some favorable way to us, right? There's some kindness and compassion and, dare I say, love that is kind of intrinsic to human beings, and without which the human species would
so
not have survived.
and again, that's the science actually shows us that. And I think one of the things that I really appreciate about that essay and about the solidarity economy is it doesn't assume that human beings are demonic. It doesn't assume that human beings are angelic.
Yeah,
It says, look, humans tend to do what we're incentivized to do. We tend towards wanting nice things, right? Like we're not pathological, we're not sociopaths, although there is something about that
right.
1% that we ought to think about the magic of the we are the 99% and who the hell are those 1% sociopaths that tend to end up as CEOs of transnational corporations. But the point is, y'all, that the solidarity economy framework says let's incentivize the kind of things and the virtues that we say that we want. And to me, that's something I think that is incredibly both inspiring and actually quite practical. I
Yeah.
also want to let you know, Emily, we've had some great comments in the chat I want to get to. Z Manny asks, what role does grassroots community media play in these communities in your experience? I think that's a great question. And I'm going to ask you, as a both theorist and a practitioner in your local community, grassroots community media, what role, if any?
Good question. I'm not very well qualified to answer that. Certainly not where I work, which is in the lower valley of the Connecticut River Valley, lower valley, which is where the urban centers are. There is no there is not much community media, and certainly the community media that exists has not cottoned on to solidarity economy. Whereas in the Upper Valley, which is where the five colleges are, there's lots and lots of media that really does play an important role in promoting these ideas. And yeah, but
And
where I am, not so much.
uh, uh, thank you for the questions, Imani, and for the candid answer, Emily. I have the privilege of living in Humboldt County, California. What we laughingly call people in San Francisco Bay Area is the real Northern California, right? Like it's very rural, but it's also remote. And so for us, media is a lifeblood. Why? Because like we just don't have the kind of corporate media can be consumed, right? But the local community radio, there's still a local newspaper that is like thriving. There's all sorts of local community radio that is non-corporately filtered, that plays a vital role. And I can tell you, I myself have been both a content creator and still am on our community radio station, and it's been a vital lifeblood for us. So Z Manny, what I would say is, to quote Jello Biafra, the co-founder and lead singer for the Dead Kennedys, don't hate the corporate media, become people's media. And that's what we're trying to do here on Redneck Gone Green. I want to turn also to Catherine, who asks, is it possible for a solidarity economy to exist alongside a capitalist system, or is it either or? And I got to tell you, Catherine, like you have teed Emily Kawano up, because I have heard her answer this question. Emily, what do you say? Either or?
Hmm. I mean, I would say solidarity economy exists now, right? It's just not very well connected up so that we can see it and perceive it as a different system. But these practices exist all around. I mean, a couple ways in which probably many of us are already engaged in solidarity economy. Solidarity economy would certainly count unpaid care work as an important economic activity. And just because it's not waged, not paid for, doesn't mean that it's not vitally important and should be supported in terms of policies. Um, so probably we all and are carers in one way for our parents, for our kids, for our siblings, for our neighbors, right? We all engage in that kind of stuff. And why do we do it? We don't do it for profit, right? We do it out of a sense of care and solidarity, right? It makes us feel good. Um, so there's lots of ways in which people. I mean, a lot of people belong to a credit union, and I'm not sure how many people realize that a credit union is a type of a cooperative. Whether or not that credit union really um, does good education about what it is, right? In theory, at least, or in structure, it is owned by its depositors, right?
And in fact,
Um,
remember credit unions, the board of directors are actually elected by the members, right?
yeah,
Like, so there is a democratic framework. It's usually not utilized,
yeah.
in my opinion, in my experience, right?
Yeah,
But they
but the
are.
structure is there,
It is
and
absolutely there.
there are a lot of things that could be a lot more democratic and a lot more, um, yeah, in some ways a lot more progressive that have kind of gotten absorbed into the system. So in my neck of the woods, there's a very large mutual, Mass Mutual is a big what do you call it? The kind of what is it? Life insurance company, really big. And so they started off. It was people coming together as a mutual society, pulling their money for funerals and burial services, right? And there is a way in which they're so big now. They've a little bit lost those roots. Um, yeah, there's a lot of examples like that, but the potential is there, right, for them to be much more democratic and accountable and transparent and where the stakeholders can participate in decision making.
Emily, I'm going to circle us back. Earlier, you talked about the Wellspring ecosystem. And for
Hmm.
those who are watching, you're going to actually get a chance to see it. But I'm going to invite you to read it out for those who are listening to the podcast. Tell us a little bit more about the ecosystem there in
Yeah.
Wellspring.
So so I would say this is particularly important if you are engaged in co-op development in struggling, underserved, marginalized communities, which is where we are, and that is our mission, right? Springfield is your typical deindustrialized city that is really struggling. Um, Majority people of color, large immigrant population, the usual, right? Um, in the Upper Valley, right, where that I mentioned, where there are the 5 colleges, it's a different world. It's just a completely different world, and co-ops thrive in the Upper Valley. Um, I believe if we ran the numbers, we would have one of the most worker co-op dense regions in the entire country, given that we're relatively rural. They don't need this ecosystem, right? But the communities that we're working in, they need this kind of support. So yeah, we found in helping to jumpstart, to incubate these co-ops, there is a need for we provide some of that co-op business TA, technical assistance, but also there are others like connecting them to lenders, to other people who have other kinds of business technical assistance, whether it's co-op or not, because there's a lot of lessons and skills that are just common to all businesses, whether it's a co-op or not. We know that we need to build that public sector support and supportive policies. So engaging with city council and on a statewide level, we're starting to build that out, that movement in Massachusetts. Um, we know that a lot of our folks, a lot of our workers really need various kinds of social service supports, whether it's transportation or childcare or housing or mental health support. And we've been trying for many years to try to build those connections with social service providers. There's many, 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 but to be able to do a warm handoff instead of just a cold referral. So building those relationships is important. From the get-go, we were very deliberate about building our table, not only with the anchor institutions, but also with community organizations and labor organizations. So we always want to make sure that they had just as much voice as the anchor institutions. So that's the last category, just building these relationships with the large institutions. Um, I would say um, this we've gone beyond this in some ways. So we do talk about a co-op ecosystem, but we also expanded our mission a couple years ago from uh, developing cooperative businesses to also supporting the development of solidarity economy initiatives. For people that don't know that terminology, we'll call it a cooperative community initiative. Because in our neck of the woods, it's still not a well known term.
You know,
But we have found, let me just say why. Just even these are valuable in and of themselves. Like, what can communities, what can folks do for themselves, um, especially collectively? But also trying to build the on ramp to either become a worker in a worker co op or a group that might think about starting up their own cooperative business. Um, most of the communities, like, people are not ready to be able to do that, and so having some experience with some kind of a cooperative initiative is we see that also as an on ramp to the cooperative business development and also the workforce, right, like worker owners.
so this literally leads into a comment that Kelly made that I want to lift up. Kelly observes scarcity, or the idea of scarcity, drives so much of the greed. As we look further into the climate crisis, could you talk about the solidarity economy and the community that can help prepare for the impacts of the climate crisis? It's not coming, it's literally here and getting
Right,
worse.
right. So, there is scarcity if everybody wants to consume like the 1%. And there is abundance if
If we
that
share,
isn't,
just say
if
it.
we share. But also it's sharing, but it is also like not everybody can even share a yacht and a fleet of, big cars, etc. Right? So I mean, those are, for some people, right? It is a hard pill to swallow that we do have to think about the overall level of consumption that is often what people aspire to. Some people can't afford to consume at that level, but that's commonly the kind of level of consumption that people aspire to, and that is not sustainable.
It's not
In turn,
sustainable.
yeah,
And Emily, because I'm going to grapple with you a bit about this, because I would argue that if we take a look at Edward Bernays, and there, by the way, there's a special place in hell for Edward Bernays. If folks don't know about who that is, Jack, let's take a note. I think you and I ought to do a deep dive on Edward Bernays sometime on here on Redneck Gone Green. But I would argue that so much of the materialism and the consumerism that is hyper destroying the planet now is literally being created, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it's like a crack addiction where the moment of acquisition is what we've been sort of programmed to want. It's not the inherent act of having this cup. It
yeah,
is to like, oh, I want to purchase this thing. So it becomes like a crack cocaine addiction, and it's just in the moment of acquisition. So we
And
just,
it
yeah.
and it's no accident, right? This is one of the kind of intrinsic problems of capitalism, right? Businesses are all trying to maximize their profits, right? And in order to do that, they got to sell you stuff. And so to crank up people's uh, aspirations of consumption is absolutely critical and intrinsic to capitalism. You just are not going to get away
And
from
it's
it. It's
not intrinsic to economics, right? The
yeah,
idea
no,
of
no,
producing and
yeah,
distributing goods and
yeah,
services, that capitalism created that, right?
yeah,
In
yeah,
order for profit maximization, because
yeah,
this idea, if the narrative of Homo economicus
yeah,
is your driving narrative,
yeah,
then then the consequences will follow.
yeah.
Folks, what
Um,
I think Emily and I are suggesting is if we had a different narrative about why, who we are, and what is the good life. And I would argue this, Emily, like, we're told by the ruling, no, correction, not the ruling elite. They're not better than us. The predatory class uh, tries to say that people are lazy, they don't want to work, etc. And I call bullshit on that because, like, my lived experience is people want to work.
yeah,
If by work we understand meaningful, productive
yeah,
human activity,
right,
if you're going to do something that is lifted up and applauded and appreciated by your community, and other people go, "Way to go, Emily!" Like, thank you for that. Like,
right,
that feels good to us,
yeah.
right? It is
But they
only
don't want to work on something that is just awful and alienating and frustrating, and you have no voice and you have no control and you have some, yeah, a terrible workplace, right? Like that's terrible, and you spend, maybe a third of your life in that place. It's really a terrible thing. But I do want to get back to the climate change thing and solidarity economy. I do think solidarity economy has some thoughts about ways forward. The fundamental true, it's the narrative, it's the very fundamental logic of what solidarity is about, right? That um, we exist and we live and we work and we socialize in order to meet our own needs, which are both material and immaterial. And right now, it's so skewed towards the material needs, and more and more and more. And that is driving this climate crisis, right? It is unsustainable, and so that's part of it, right? Like understanding that a really basic part of human needs, right, just like shelter and food and clothing, is that need to connect with each other. And so if we spent a little less time working in order to buy stuff and spending more time connecting with each other, there is this moment here where this that I think is kind of interesting to think about leveraging, right? The Surgeon General has declared that there's this crisis, an epidemic of loneliness, right? And there's all kinds of statistics about how it shortens your life and leads to heart and this, that, and the other, all kinds of diseases, right? And solidarity economy is about those human connections, which in so many ways, capitalism isolates us, right? And we get just absorbed in the work and the earning and the purchasing, right? The consumption, and not the connecting and the community and being with other people. Those things don't cost anything, and it doesn't need to draw on the resources of Mother Earth, right? Like hanging out together. And so that's a lot of what solidarity economy is about, right? Is
And
that's an
what I love about it is again, it's not actually new. It's a return
yeah,
to how all humans once existed. And I like to say all the time, I'm a guest on Wiyot ancestral territory here in far northern Humboldt County. But what I do know is that I, just like Emily and you, the listener viewer, we all descend from indigenous peoples. All of our ancestors once lived in balance, in right relationship before, and usually it was the enclosure movement of either imperialists and or others. which brings me to Z-Manny's next comment, which is this logic of enclosing the commons to seize and privatize common resources, then base, quote, industry on gatekeeping after that. He goes on to say, but there seems to be a deep desire for this more cooperative scenario. And I've heard you talk about this before, Emily, in the so-called tragedy of the commons. And I want to invite you to break that down a little bit. Is it really true that people can share the commons, or is there going to be this constant ultimate destruction of the commons if folks are not forced to do something?
So if people know the work of Eleanor Ostrom, she won the Nobel Prize in economics some years ago. Her work was looking at the commons, right? And she really decimated that tragedy of the commons piece. She did research into these common pool resources that were collectively managed. So, for example, fisheries and forests, and uh, found that if there are no rules and it's a free for all, it is pretty likely that there will be this, like the temptation to take more than your share, right, which will destroy the commons, is likely to happen. So if you are going to create these commons, there do need to be clear, well-known rules, and there needs to be surveillance, or there needs to be an awareness of if somebody violates those rules, and there also needs to be some consequences. And
Right.
without that, there will be abuses. So I think what's brilliant about that is saying absolutely there are uh, there are societies that have used a commons framework for millennia, very, very, very successfully, more successfully than managed through private hands. But we shouldn't be all Pollyanna about it and just think, oh, we're just angels, right? We're just good, and we're loving, and we're sharing and caring. We are that, but we also have to be realistic that we do
Which is
need at the same time, so policies and rules, and everybody needs to know what they are, and if somebody abuses, you need a way to know that and for there to be repercussions.
And that's why I would argue, Emily, it's important that we incentivize the kind of conduct that we want to see. It's about systems. And I want to lift up Catherine responded in the chat. It was like that. That is the sharing when during World War II when I was a girl. Rationing caused no real conflict because we just shared what was available. And I think that there is something to that, right? And I am now noticing, Emily, that the time has just flown by. We've been at it for an hour. So I do want to give you an opportunity and an invitation for any final thoughts or closing remarks.
Well, I guess I would close by saying that, circling back to what you opened with, of hopefully seeding some hope. I think these are really dire times. I think these are really scary times. I've been cynical since I was very young, and so whatever kind of crises came never particularly worried me. But now, right now, I am worried between climate change and this, the threat of fascism and this kind of virulent fanning of hatred, and nativism is really scary. Um, and for me personally, working on building solidarity economy is what keeps me sane, right? Like I feel like I'm doing something. I feel like it is hopeful. I feel like this is a moment that is so urgent to be pulling together and building this other world and connecting the dots. There's a huge foundation to build on. And no matter where you are, no matter what you do, you can engage, right? Even if it is just being a little more kind, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more patient, a little bit more cooperative, a little bit that's part of it, right? How we are as human beings. Capitalism will feed and incentivize and nurture that Homo economicus, but there is within all of us the Homo solidaricus, right? There is that turning towards all that good stuff, our better angels. And that's part of building the solidarity economy. And even if you feel like, oh, there's no co-op near me, or there's no community land trust near me, or there's no, like, you can practice this just in the way you are, and the way you are with other people, and the way you treat the earth.
Thank you so much, Emily Kawano. Folks, we've been talking to Emily Kawano, who's the co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network and co-director of the Wellspring Cooperative Corporation, that are incubating and seeding solidarity economy practices and principles across her community in Springfield, Massachusetts. Next week, we will be joined by Dr. Anna Malino. We'll be talking about national single payer. In the meantime, I'm going to ask everyone, please like, comment, and share. Our audience is getting larger, stronger, and better organized. And I believe that together we can not just, we can co-create the world that we so desperately need and so richly deserve. Peace.